she hadn't left books or papers, but she had left her sampler, and we were able to unpick the clues from there.
I went into the workshop and he said, "Oh, I've got something you might be interested in," and he showed me the said sampler. I said, "Oh, it looks very interesting. How much do you want for it?"
It was a nighttime auction. Very few people go to it. It was sitting up near the front door for all the world to see. I thought, this is absolutely fantastic. I think I sold it to John for $3,000. He put up a fight. I said, "I'm sorry, John, but it's worth much, much more money than I'm offering it to you for."
And so this was a little bit out of my current line. I took it back to my work and thought, well, I'll wait till I go over to England to see Jenny, and I'll take it over to her and get her to research it.
Well, I wasn't going to take that fragile, large object as hand luggage on a plane, so I said, well, I'm sure it's very interesting, but maybe not just now.
And then it turned out that I was taking my youngest son, Danny, with me over to meet all his relatives in England, and I carried it through to my mother's place in Oxford.
And it was so large that we had to put it in the back of the car when we were coming through England, having met him at Heathrow Airport. When we went into the history of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, we discovered that, as well as being a contributor to the Nation newspaper, he was actively involved in the Young Ireland Rising.
So the Young Irelanders, of course, were a different kind of revolutionary. They were much more cultured and more fitted to a constitutional politics, had it been possible in Ireland at the time.
He was rowed out to the boat a few miles outside Derry at Tremone Bay. He went to the USA disguised as a priest.
Dorcas and her sister, they were known as the sisters of the Honourable T.D. McGee, and they had quite a standing in the town of Castlemaine because of their famous brother, because he was a famous politician in Canada, so that tended to be reported in the newspaper. And then, of course, his assassination in Canada hit the headlines. In June of the year of his assassination, there was a public subscription made by the Mount Alexander Mail to raise money for the sisters of Thomas D'Arcy McGee.
We visited all the libraries in Belfast, down in the National Library in Dublin, and really we had problems finding out about the poem.
The breakthrough really came when Brendan Meegan discovered that it actually was a poem. Myself and Brendan Meegan going down to Belfast Central Library and going through the microfilm of The Nation to see whether we could spot this poem.
Dorcas, the woman who had been invisible up to now, had left her clues in the stitching of her sampler, and she hadn't left books or papers, but she had left her sampler, and we were able to unpick the clues from there, and just so much came out of it.
The 14th of February was the date on which the sampler was finished by Dorcas, and she just puts these 3 dots after her name on the sampler, and that presumably was being very modestly just, she wasn't identifying herself as obviously as the sister of T.D. McGee, but the ... presumably referred to McGee, so Dorcas McGee.
She presumably made the sampler whilst in Dublin, and from there she travelled to Liverpool, from whence she emigrated to Australia.
We know that when people emigrated, especially in the 19th century, they took luggage with them.
My mum and I, we went to the Emigration Museum in Melbourne and looked at their database and looked at the ship's lists to see if we could find a Dorcas McGee who was a passenger, and we did.
She came across a reference to a Dorcas McGee arriving in Australia at the right time. However, her name was spelt slightly differently and her date of birth was out by a couple of years. Initially we thought this might have been significant, but then on further research we realised that accurate records were not always kept, and that ages could be taken as approximate.
The other interesting thing was that in examining these death certificates and the birth and marriage certificates of Anna Marie's children, we were able to find a lot more about the McGee family in Ireland. One of the clues we found was that on one of the certificates, Anna Maria, that's Dorcas's sister, was listed as having been born in Cushendall, County Antrim. And this was amazing because we had always thought the family lived in Carlingford until they moved to Wexford. And that set us on the trail of, well, where did Dorcas's family live when they were young?
The father was a coast guard here. And they lived up in what is now Newry or Dundalk Street in Carlingford. The house is no longer there, but there is a little plaque commemorating the house in which they were brought up.
I approached Michael personally and asked him to tell me the name and the address of the place he got it from. He was a bit reluctant to, but I offered him a couple of bottles of red wine and told him it would have no adverse effect on him. I think he was a bit worried that the people were asking for the stuff back, or you're never quite sure how far within the law you're operating when you're out buying things. So he told me the address, and that was the start of the treasure hunt, I suppose.
She was a descendant of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, and that her brother and sister-in-law knew a lot more about it.
The sampler had been left to Bernie's sister because she was the last one left at home, so it went with her when her mother died.
They brought out all sorts of newspapers which recorded the death of the famous Thomas D'Arcy McGee. There was mention in a letter from Bernard's grandmother, there was mention of her Aunt Dorcas. She'd been to Castlemaine and she'd found out quite a lot of sources and a lot of information there, and she very generously shared it with us. And then we thought, well, we'd go to Castlemaine too and follow it up. And we also found the house where Dorcas lived. We were, with the help of the people in the Historical Society, we were able to identify it. And it's next door to what is now Tonk's paint shop, and they were really helpful in the shop, and they showed us this very old shop, and we imagined Dorcas living next door and having her milliner's shop there and having the sampler hanging on the wall, because I think she would have had that sampler. It was probably framed in Australia, but she would have had the sampler on the wall as a proclamation of her identity and her great love for her brother.
The sampler took pride of place in the exhibition, which was launched in August 2005 at the Ulster American Folk Park, and it was marvellous that the that Pat and Bernard Slattery were able to be present and be guests of honour to formally open the exhibition, talk about the object.
A antique dealer of some repute came along and said, "Have you got anything old stuff to sell?" Something to that effect. And she said, "Oh, well, you can go and have a look in the garage." And he went to look at the garage and saw the sample. I don't think he really would have had the faintest idea what it was about. Took a lot of old photos and a few other odds and ends. They ended up in an auction house in Melbourne.
One of the things that has come out of it for Pat and Bernard is that Pat has developed a curriculum unit for use with children in schools in Australia.
Well, Mystery of History is a crate of stuff about Thomas D'Arcy McGee and all the bits and pieces that we've found to do with him and the history in Bernie's family. So they had a good time and it changed their attitude to history.
The greatest reward for me is the interest value. Now this sampler is going to took over our family life. We've had a few different trips, we've met people from all over the world, and it's been like a treasure hunt, both in a historical sense and in a family sense for us, and we've all really enjoyed getting involved in it. Maybe the story's not over yet. Are we filming?
I'm camera shy now, I'm embarrassed and I'm stage fright.
They'd never heard of Ireland before. They didn't even know where it was on a map.
Anyway, I hope all this research makes this sampler the most valuable sampler in the world, and we can sell it for probably $3 or $4 million to the Canadian government or a museum somewhere. And then we can help small animals that have been damaged in bushfires with the proceeds. That's what we really want to do. Isn't it, Peggy?
Is that what you want?
Marvellous, I reckon.